Good evening. I'm Katie Kane. I'm from the English department, and I want to welcome you all to the last event in the President's Lecture Series, the Lucille Spear Memorial Lecture. We're indeed fortunate this evening to have with us one of the great poets of our age, Paul Muldoon. Before I provide you with a bit of information, a bit of introduction, I should say, for Muldoon, I need to thank some of the people involved in organizing tonight's event. We must, of course, thank President George Dennison for his commitment to this lecture series, which brings to our community all kinds of distinguished authors, artists, and scholars. I also want to thank Professor Richard Drake, who is the series' primary architect and organizing mind. And then I just want to quickly thank some of the people behind the scenes who donated their time to help bring Professor Muldoon here. Professor David Emmons, who deserves his own round of applause. Michelle O'Shaughnessy and Shar Bonebright in the President's Office, and then my colleagues in English, literature, creative writing, and teacher education. So thanks to all those people. So I'll just give you a little bit of background information here, some biographical information on our distinguished speaker this evening. He was born in Portadown, County Armagh, in the north of Ireland. Professor Muldoon is currently Professor of Poetry at the University of Oxford and University Professor in the Humanities at Princeton. Like the material of his poetry, Muldoon is afoot in many places and many genres. You can find him, as I said this afternoon, in virtually all of the major anthologies of Irish and British poetry which have been published in the last 30 years. You can find him translating poetry from the Irish and Hebrew, writing opera librettos, penning very astute literary criticism, writing drama, and even doing rock and roll songs. He's a very accomplished writer. Prolific, playful, perspicacious, Muldoon is a recent recipient of the Pulitzer Prize for his luminous and sustaining version, or volume, I should say, of poetry, Moy Sand and Gravel, and he is, I'm sure, going to be reading some selections from that material this evening. I think I'm in a kind of a bad spot having to introduce somebody who is as brilliant at the use of language as Paul Muldoon. And it would be foolish of me under those circumstances, even though it's my duty, or as Paul would say, duty, to belabor an introduction. I'm not going to do that. I think his poetry and his other textual endeavors speak for themselves with unmatchable grace and depth. But what I will do by way of a brief prologue is to read to you just a very small bit from the great 18th century Irish poem, Cliona Art O'Leary. And I'm going to do that just, I think, to characterize what I see as the spirit of Muldoon and his poetry. And I'll read to you first. I'm going to do this briefly in the Irish, and I hope that my accent won't offend, my pronunciation won't offend, and then I'll read you the English translation too. Mochra go dangan tu, la da vaca hu, ag kian ti an marki, hug mo huil do it, hug mo hri chanab do it, delish hared lad, ivad o valya lad, is domsa narv Iraq, horas parlas a yalach gom, Rumana an rachach gom, Bacchus an Yarig dom, Briki and Yapa dom, Rosta ar Vaireb yom, Kola iglov lachan dom, Godi an Tadahar no harasta Diana leom. My steadfast love, when I saw you one day by the Market Gable house, my eye gave a look, my heart shone out. I fled with you far from friends and home, and never was sorry. You had parlors painted, rooms decked out, the oven reddened, and loaves made up, roasts on spit, and cattle slaughtered. I slept and ducked down till noontime came, or later, if I liked. I think there's much in Eileen's characterization, and what I should say she's doing here is she is engaged in a lament for her husband, Art O'Leary, who has been murdered. And what she's talking about is his generosity, his capacity, his indulgence of her, his passion, his pleasure-giving and attentiveness. And I believe that there's much in Eileen's characterization of the magnificent art, again, generosity of spirit and all the rest, that I think can be said of Paul Muldoon. He is very attentive to what the needs of his readers are. He's attentive to giving sustenance and nourishment in his words. And without further ado, I will give you Paul Muldoon.
Thank you very much indeed for that wonderful introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. Now, the thing about duty, we have to talk about that. Duty, I say duty because I had the great pleasure yesterday of having my pronunciation affirmed and confirmed when I made a trip to Butte. It was with no sense of duty that I went to Butte. It was a great sense of delight that I went there, and a great pleasure to be in this part of the world and on this particular occasion to read some poems, and afterwards actually I understand to attempt to answer a few probably not too difficult questions. If you don't mind, I'll begin with, in the light of the Butte experience, with a couple of poems having to do with far-flung Irish men. And this first one indeed, I'm taking my cue here from Katie Kane, is a translation. And it's a translation of a poem written in the 9th century by an Irish monk who had made his way over to a monastery in Austria, or what is now Austria. He'd probably, if he'd known about Butte, he'd have come here, I'm certain. But, and if he'd known about Missoula, he would certainly have come. But all he knew about was, of course, what was happening there in the monasteries in Europe. So he was working on a commentary, I believe, on Virgil. That was his day job, as it were. And in the margin of his commentary, though, he wrote a little poem. And as you probably know, much Irish literature, and perhaps much literature from all traditions, and perhaps even nowadays also, has a kind of marginal aspect. This one was literally written in the margin of a text. And it has to do with his delight in his cat, the cat was almost certainly a Welsh cat. How do I know that? Well, I don't really know it, but I'm going to propose it anyhow, and I'm proposing it because his name, Ponger, is a Welsh word, and it means a fuller of cloth. Someone, in other words, who kneads fuller's earth into lanolin, soaked or whatever, wool, to clean it. And it's a great description there of the cat. I thought you'd like that. Anyway, so there's a little drawing. It's a rather long drawn out, and perhaps indeed overly long drawn out comparison by this monk between himself and his cat. So this anonymous monk: myself and Ponger. Myself and Ponger, my white cat, have much the same calling, in that much as Ponger goes after mice, I go hunting for the precise word. He and I are much the same, in that I'm gladly lost to fame when on the Georgics, say, I'm bent, while he seems perfectly content with his lot. Bless you. Life in the cloister can't possibly lose its luster so long as there's some crucial point with which we might by leaps and bounds yet grapple, into which yet sink our teeth. The bold Ponger will think through mouse snagging, much as I muse on something naggingly abstruse, then fix his clear, unflinching eye on our lime-white sail wall, while I focus, insofar as I can, on the limits of what a man may know. Something of his rapture at his most recent mouse capture I share when I too get to grips with what has given me the slip. And so we while away our whiles, never cramping each other's styles, but practicing the noble arts that so lift and lighten our hearts. Ponger going in for the kill with all his customary skill, while I, sharp-witted, swift and sure, shed light on what had seemed obscure. Now, before they quite made it out here to Montana, there were many Irish labouring men who'd done their stint on the East Coast. And this next poem features a few of those. I live in a house which is on the Delaware and Raritan Canal, which is one of the canals built by Irishmen, predominantly by Irishmen, who dug it by, well, one doesn't want to say by hand and foot, with very crude spades and shovels. They were drunk most of the time. The only way, it seems, and it's understandable, I think, the only way they could possibly manage that kind of work. Many of them died in the process of digging the Delaware and Raritan Canal, and the spirits of some of them, I think, are lurking about in this poem, which is set, as I say, in this house that overlooks the canal. But long before the canal was built, it was built in the 1830s, the house had been built in 1750 or 51, and in those days, when one was building a house, certainly in that part of the world, the great tradition was to incorporate some horse hair into the plaster to bind it. So that if one has, and one certainly does have, occasion to drill a hole in a wall, you can see the little horse hairs in the little flecks of horse hairs, which get a mention along the way here. What else? It ends up by, it seems, being a poem about a loaf of bread. It focuses on a loaf of bread along the way, like so many songs and poems. It uses a refrain, which is borderline nonsense, sense. Some days it seems to make more sense than others. We'll see how we are here. You can join in if you like, as we go along. The loaf. When I put my finger to the hole they've cut for a dimmer switch, in a wall of plaster, stiffened with horse hair, it seems I've scratched a 200-year-old itch with a pink and a pink and a pinky pick. When I put my ear to the hole, I'm suddenly aware of spades and shovels turning up the gain, all the way from Raritan to the Delaware, with a clink and a clink and a clinky click. When I put my nose to the hole, I smell the floodplain off the canal after a hurricane, and the spots of green grass where thousands of Irish have lain, with a stink and a stink and a stinky stink. When I put my eye to the hole, I see one holding horse dung to the rain, in the hope, indeed, of washing out a few whole ears of grain, with a wink and a wink and a winky wink. And when I do at last succeed in putting my mouth to the horsehair fringed niche, I can taste the small loaf of bread he baked from that whole seed, with a link and a link and a linky lick. People come into this house and look at one particular painting on a wall, which is a painting of a very stern, very angry-looking woman whose eyes follow one around the room in a very perturbing way. And of course, the first thing they say is, who is that? Who on earth is that? And we, of course, have learned to say that is the ancestor. The ancestor. The great-grandmother who bears down on us as if beholding the mote in our eye from a 19th century Hungarian portrait on our library wall is no relation, not even remote. The straw-hatted man in a daguerreotype, though he and I may share the trait of putting 2 fingers to the little carbuncle on our right chin, is no more of my blood than I am consanguineous with Cromwell. Our Webster's is inscribed Philip, best uncle. Our napkins bear an unfamiliar monogram. Yet how familiar all become. Shaving mug, gymkhana rosette, 5 charms from a charm bracelet. All those heirlooms to which we're now the heirs are at once more presentable and more present than our own. This great-grandmother with folded arms who lurches and looms across the library may not be so unreasoning in her reprimand. Well, let me go back and read a few poems set in the north of Ireland where I was brought up. And this first one it was County Armagh, about halfway across Northern Ireland. A hilly region, nothing compared to this part of the world, of course. Drumlin country, Drumlin's tiny little, it's often described in guidebooks as being basket of egg-like, tiny little post-glacial hills. And on those, one of the main crops, I suppose, was anyhow, apples. And in October, November, the apples had been gathered, of course, for about a month, and the other chores had been done. And now groups of men and women would get together in little sheds to peel the apples. And in this poem, the main character, the little fella in the poem, happens upon a group of apple peelers, and he overhears something that he shouldn't have heard, something that might have a telltale aspect to it. So that, in fact, the title of the poem is Tell, though I think by the time we get to the end of the poem, the tell in question is William Tell and his son, Tell Jr., Tell the Second, whatever he was. We don't even remember that guy's name, I think, do we? Anyway, the couple of things. Yeah, the word peeler, of course, in that part of the world has another little resonance. A policeman, a peeler, Sir Robert Peel and his boys. A tilly is a kind of kerosene lamp. So here we go. Tell. He opens the scullery door, and a sudden rush of wind, as raw, brushes past him as he himself will brush past the stacks of straw that stood in earlier for Crow or Comanche teepees hung with scalps, but tonight pass muster row upon row for the foothills of the Alps. He opens the door of the peeling shed, just as one of the apple peelers, one of almost a score of red-cheeked men who pare and core the red-cheeked apples for a few spare shillings, mutter something about bloodshed and the peelers. The red-cheeked men put down their knives at one and the same moment. All but his father, who somehow connives to close one eye as if taking aim or holding back a tear, and shoots him a glance he might take as it whizzes past his ear for another crow or Comanche lance hurled through the tilly-lit gloom of the peeling shed. Were he not to hear what must be an apple split above his head? Let me stick with that landscape, the drumlin country there, and read a poem. Someone asked me if I might read this, and I'm very happy to do so, particularly here in Montana. It's a poem called Cows. We have them too, nowhere near as many of them. Very kind of modest little cows. In fact, there are parts of that landscape where that's about all we have, because it's not really arable land, but it's good for cattle. They can hang out there and eat away till it's time. And then, in this poem, the speaker is walking along a very, very dark road in County Monaghan, which is just over the border in the Republic of Ireland. And they've been passed out, they've been overtaken by a truck. And it's all a little bit like that last poem, something's going on. It's a part of the world where some people get up to no good, or at least used to, of one kind or another. Let me see. What should I say? A drogue is as I'm sure we know, a rocket-propelled bomb. Oh, I think that's about it. It's just a little meditation, as they say. I hate that. Meditation. It's a poem about cows. Even as we speak, there's a smoker's cough from behind the whitethorn hedge. We stop dead in our tracks, a distant tingle of water into a trough. In the past half hour, since a cattle truck all but sent us shuffling off this mortal coil, we've consoled ourselves with the dregs of a bottle of Redbreast. Had Hawthorne been a Gael, I insist, the scarlet A on Hester Prynne would have stood for alcohol. This must be the same truck whose taillights burn so dimly, as if caked with dirt, 300 or 400 yards along the Boreen, a diminutive form of the Gaelic boher, a road, from bow, a cow, and har, meaning, in this case, something like a thwart. Boreen has entered English through the air, despite the protestations of the OED, which has a habit of describing such words as coming through the air. Anyway, why though should one tail light flash and flare, then flicker fade to an after image of tourmaline, set in a dark part jet, part jasper or jade? That smoker's cough again. It triggers off from drumlin to drumlin an emphysemantophone of cows. They hoist themselves onto their trampoline and steady themselves, and straightway divine water in some far-flung spot to which they then gravely incline. This is no Devon cow coterie, by the way, whey-faced with spode hooves and horns, nor are they the metaphysic cattle of Japan that have merely to anticipate scoring a bullseye and lo, it happens. These are earth flesh, earth blood, salt of the earth, whose talismans are their own jawbones, buried under threshold and hearth. For though they trace themselves to the kith and kine that presided over the birth of Christ, so carry their calves a full 9 months, and boast licorice cashews on their tongues. They belong more to the line that's tramped these coons and corries since Cuchulainn tramped Aoife. Again the flesh, again the fed. However I might allegorize some Oscar binary bevy of cattle, there's no getting round this cattle truck. One light on the blink, laden with what? Microwaves? Hi-fis? Oscar binary, a twin, entwined, a tree, a Tuareg, a double dung beetle, a plain and simple high-firing party, and off the back of a lorry drogue. Enough of Colette and Celine and Paul Celan, enough of whether Nabokov taught at Wellesley or Wesleyan. Now let us talk of slaughter and the slain, the helicopter gunship, the mighty Kalashnikov. Let's rest for a while in a place where a cow has lain. The Oscar I mentioned there was the name of one of our dogs, who has since passed away, I'm afraid. I'm going to read a little poem. I was thinking about him the other day. In fact, I think I dreamed about him the other day. So I hope you'll bear with me when I read this. Oscar, where is he? Not a lot to be said about it, you'll be glad to hear. Either before or maybe even after, who knows. I've got to read another poem first, just by way of introduction to it. And it's a poem having to do with the word we had in our house for hot water bottle, which was the word quoof. Now, we needed hot water bottles in that part of the world. And I suppose we could have called them hot water bottles, but we didn't. We called them quoofs. For a long time I wondered if it might have been, well, first of all, I wondered, I suppose, if it might have been a corruption of a Gaelic word for a hot water bottle. But I suppose that seemed not so promising. Then I wondered if it might have been a corruption of, say, Elizabethan usage for a hot water bottle. Also not such a fruitful path, probably. So I remember, actually, after I wrote this poem, I asked my father about the word quoof, which at some level I also thought might have been handed down from generation to generation of Muldoons. It's a little kind of private thing we had. But no, he said the first time he heard it was from us, the kids. And what exactly we were trying to say, I don't know. But there it was. Quoof. How often have I carried our family word for the hot water bottle to a strange bed, as my father would juggle a red-hot half-brick in an old sock to his childhood settle. I've taken it into so many lovely heads, or laid it between us like a sword. A hotel room in New York City with a girl who spoke hardly any English. My hand on her breast, like the smouldering one-off spur of the Yeti, or some other shy beast that is yet to enter the language. Now, I can't help but notice that directly underneath it is a poem called Bigfoot. Now, I don't know how the demise of Bigfoot struck you guys, but I can tell you for me, and I think for many people, even in the East, it was a tragedy that it was discovered that Bigfoot really wasn't what he was cracked up to be. But anyway, this is called Bigfoot. Bigfoot comes, if he comes at all, among sumac and birches, stops halfway across the clearing, wood smoke, the cabin where you mourn your wife, where darkening the tiny window is the fur coat you promised her when she was 20 or 21. You forget. So here's Oscar. Be that as it may, I'm wakened by the moans, not of the wind, nor the wood demons, but Oscar McOscar, as we call the hound, who's wangled himself into our bed. Why? Why not? He lies between us like an ancient quoif, with a snout of perished gutta percha, and whines at something on the roof. I'm suddenly mesmerized by what I saw only today, a pair of high heels abandoned on the road to Amherst. And I've taken off over the towns of Keady and Auchnacloy and Caledon, it in Arcadia, to a grave lit by acetylene, in which, though she preceded him by a good 10 years, my mother's skeleton has managed to worm its way back on top of the old man's, and she once again has him under her thumb. Now, enough of that, I think, at the moment. I'm going to read a little poem about Oscar, one of Oscar's successors. I suppose I should say that, because I meant to say a word or two about these poems, that I do believe in a poetry that is disturbing and that doesn't necessarily give solace and knocks us back a little bit every so often, gives us a little jolt. Anyway, this one has to do with this new dog, Angus, and I was sitting in a house in Vermont last year, sitting on the porch. Angus was stretched out, as a dog should be, and I looked up and I saw a coyote, or did you say coyote? Coyote. Walking, trotting up the path, and it was kind of disturbing because Angus didn't notice the coyote, though it was quite close. It was only maybe 4 or 5 rows, 6 rows away. That was a bit of a, that was a black mark, I think, against Angus. But more disturbingly, I think, the coyote didn't notice us either, which, could be a problem for a coyote dam. Anyway, after a while, I began to realize why Angus hadn't noticed the coyote. One of the images in the poem has to do with playing marbles, which was a great game when we were kids. Is it played here at all? Playing marbles? Yeah, one sees them for sale here and there. I haven't seen kids play them for ages. One of the types of marble, of course, that one had was one that one kept, which was known as a keepsake. A keepsake. Do you use that word? A keepsake. Anyway, the coyote, veering down the track like a girl veering down a cobbled street in the meatpacking district. High heels from the night before, black shawl of black-tipped hairs, steering clear of that fluorescent ring, spray-painted on an even stretch of blacktop, like a ring in which we might once have played keepsies, veering down the track without the slightest acknowledgement from Angus, The dog lying in a heap on our porch, like a heap of clothes lying beside a bed. Angus, who had himself been found wandering by the highway somewhere on the far side of Lake Champlain. Slubberford, slammerkin, backbone showing through. And though we didn't know it when we brought him home, blind in one eye, the right one, the one between him and the coyote, the cloudy, flaw-fleckered marble of that eye, now turning on you and me, taking in the spray-painted ring where you and I knuckle down. We'll read a series of short, snapshot-like poems set up in that part of the world also. And great pleasure to see, among others here this evening, Robert Pack, who for many years taught at the Braille School of English, where I do a little work these days. And one of the perks is to get to spend some time on the Homer Noble farm, which was the farm on which Robert Frost, which was owned by Frost, and where he spent his summers between 1939 and his death. And it's quite an energizing place to be, not least because of all the animals lurking around. Now, I know you've got animals here, and your animals, I think, would outdo these. But we have a few of them over there. Going on in the background here is a little bit of jazz. A couple of times. I was saying somewhere the other day that after I wrote this, I began to wonder if I shouldn't have called it, rather than calling it news headlines from the Homer Noble farm, it's kind of a bit long drawn out, I might have called it Deep Thoughts. After the Saturday Night Live segment, because as you'll see, as at least as I hope you'll see, some of these are extremely profound. So watch out for them as they go. Well, they're very short and profound. So I've numbered them, but I'm not going to number them here. Otherwise, we'll be here all night. News headlines from Deep Thoughts. That case-hardened cop. A bull moose in a bog hole brought him to a stop. From his grassy knoll, he has you in his crosshairs, the accomplice mole. This sword once a share, this forest a fresh-faced farm, this stone once a stair. The birch crooks her arm, as if somewhat more inclined to welcome the swarm. He has, you will find, two modes only, the chipmunk. Fast forward, rewind. The smell, like a skunk, of coffee about to perk. Thelonious Monk. They're the poker work of some sort of woodpecker, these holes in the bark. My new fact checker claims that pilus means pestle. My old fact checker. The rose and thistle, where the hummingbird drops in to wet his whistle. Behind, I think that's one of the most profound of all. Behind the woodbin, a garter snake snaps itself, showing us some skin. Like most bits of delf, the turtle seen at its best on one's neighbour's shelf, riding two abreast on their stripped down, souped up bikes, bears in leather vests. The shrike, do you have shrikes out here? The butcher bird, which impales its other little birds on thorns and barbed wire. And it has this little shade. Do you have them? It has this little shade across its forehead. It looks like an old newspaper man. Hold the front page thing, which is happening here in the middle line. The eye-shaded shrike. Bird bodies buried in bogs, a headline he'll spike. Steady like a log riding a sawmill spillway. The steady coy dog. The cornet he plays was Bolden's, then Biederbeck's, this lonesome blue jay. Some fresh auto wreck, slumped over a horn, sump pull, the frog's neck-braced neck. Brillo pants, steel wool, the regurgitations, what? Of a long-eared owl. The jet with the jot, the drive-in screen with the sky, the blood with the blot. How all seems to vie. Not just my sleeping laptop with the first firefly. With this little green light going there. Let me see. Let me go back. I'm going to read 3 or 4 poems about my children. These first 3 are about my daughter. And the first one has to do with her when she was in the womb. It has to do with a sonogram of her in the womb. And I mention along the way the town of Spiddle, which is in County Galway, Ospidal, the hospital. Spiddle. I think that's about it. The sonogram. Only a few weeks ago, the sonogram of Jean's womb resembled nothing so much as a satellite map of Ireland. Now the image is so well defined, we can make out not only a hand, but a thumb. On the road to Spiddle, a woman hitching a ride. A gladiator in his net, passing judgment on the crowd. And we found out shortly before she was born, that she was a footling breech. That's to say, she was putting a foot down rather than a head down. Breech birth. And so was delivered by scheduled cesarean. Cesarean in this part of the world, at least over in New Jersey, spelled C-E-S-A-R-I-A-N. So, footling. This I don't believe. Rather than take a header off the groin and into the groundswell, yea, verily, the groundswell of life, she shows instead her utter disregard, part diffidence, but mostly scorn for what lies behind the great sea wall and what knocks away at the great sea cliff. Though she's been in training all spring and summer and swathed herself in fat and saran wrap like an old-time channel swimmer, she's now got cold feet and turned in on herself. The phantom A in cesarean. The birth, 7 o'clock, the 7th day of the 7th month of the year. No sooner have I got myself up in lime green scrubs, a sterile cap and mask, and taken my place at the head of the table, than the windless women ply their shears and gralloch grub for a footling foot. Then, warming to their task, haul into the inestimable realm of apple blossoms and chanterelles and damsons, and eel spears, and foxes, and the general hubbub of inkies and jennets, and kickapoos with their lemnisks or peekaboo quiffs of Russian sable and tallow unctuous vernix, into the realm of the widgeon, the hue or yellow pole, not the zizum, Dorothy Aoife Correlates Muldoon. I watch through floods of tears as they give her a quick rub-a-dub and whisk her off to the nursery. Then check their staple guns for staples. And this one's about the little fella, who's now 4, and this little cradle song for him. His name is Asher. Asher, the happy boy. When they cut your birth cord yesterday, it was I who drifted away. Now I hear your name in Hebrew, blessed, as yet another release of ballast, and see beyond your wicker gondola campfires, cities, whole continents flicker. So I'm going to read a couple more poems from this book now, set back in Ireland. Little change of address. This first one is about the hound dogs that were what was said, the dog of choice in the area where I was brought up. Beagles, or bagels, as we called them. It was our duty. To do so, as we spoke Hiberno English. Anyway, these dogs, you know, beagles, well, back there, they were lying around all year pretty much, except maybe barking at the odd car, chasing after kids maybe, but essentially lying around. Then, on Boxing Day morning, the day after Christmas, they were energized suddenly because it was Boxing Day, on Boxing Day, that the hare was hunted in that part of the world. Often, of course, they'd already caught the hare, just in case, and they had kept it, and then they'd set it down, and the hounds would all run after it, and the men would stand on the hillsides and view the sport of. There was no American Idol. You must have. We had to make our own entertainment. Anyway, this is about a hare that I met one day. Beagles. That Boxing Day morning, I would hear the familiar, far-off gulls and gulders over Keenahan and Auchenlig of a pack of beagles. Old dogs disinclined to chase a car, suddenly quite unlike themselves. Pups coming helter-skelter across the ploughlands with all the chutzpah of veterans of the trenches. Their slate greys, cinnamons, liver browns, lemons, rusts, and violets turning and twisting unseen across the fields. Their gulls and gulders turning and twisting after the twists and turns of the great hare who had just now sauntered into the yard where I stood on tiptoe astride my new rally cycle, his demeanour somewhat louche, somewhat lackadaisical under the circumstances. What with him standing on tiptoe as if to mimic me, standing almost as tall as I, looking as if he might for a moment put himself in my place, thinking better of it, sloping off behind the lurry bed. This one's called a College Lands Catechism. College Lands was the name of the little parish where I was brought up. A catechism, as you know, is generally a very two-sided affair, a series of questions, a series of answers, roughly related. This being a college lands catechism, of course, that couldn't be so. This is a very lopsided affair. It's mostly questions. The answers to some of them I can guess at myself. Setanta was the name, as many of you will know, was the name of the boy who became Cuchulainn, whom we mentioned there. Cuchulainn and Aoife. I mentioned Diogenes. I mentioned Jim Hawkins, and that wonderful moment in Treasure Island where he's sitting in the hunched down in the apple barrel, and like the little fella in Tell, he hears something he shouldn't have heard. What else? The main character, I suppose, is Blondin. Did Blondin have any currency out in this part of the world? Blondin, the great tightrope walker, who I think he's sort of forgotten now, but he people still talked about him when I was a kid. He specialised. Again, we had to make our own entertainment and admire people who really made their own entertainment. Because what he liked to do was to cross Niagara Falls every so often on the tightrope, and each time he did it, he sort of upped the ante a bit. He made it slightly more difficult, or indeed a great deal more difficult. So anyway, he figures in here too, in this strange little poem. The Garden State, yes. The Orchard County is Armagh, County Armagh. A College Lands Catechism. And, you know, I think after this I might stop and then maybe have a few questions, and I could end up maybe with another poem or two. Does that seem like a... No?
Yes.
Like a plan? Let's see. A College Lands Catechism. Which is known as the Orchard County? Which as the Garden State? Which captain of the Bounty was set adrift by his mate? Who cooked and ate an omelette midway across Niagara Falls? Where did Setanta get those magical hurley balls he ram-stammed down the throat of the blacksmith's hound? Why would a Greek philosopher of note refuse to be bound by convention but live in a tub from which he might overhear, as he went to rub an apple on his sleeve, the mutineers plotting to seize the Maid of the Mist, while it was still half able to forge ahead and make half a fist of crossing the Niagara Gorge? The tub in which he might light a stove and fold the beaten eggs into themselves. Who unearthed the egg trove? And who, having eaten the omelette, would marvel at how the Mounties had so quickly closed in on him, late of the Orchard County by way of the Garden State? Thank you.
So Professor Muldoon will take some questions now, and as he said, he'll finish with a couple poems. So if you want to step up to the mics and speak into them if you have questions, feel free.
A couple of years ago, the poet Charles Simic,
Yes.
in writing a review, was speculating on what future generation of scholars might write about American poetry at the end of the 20th century. And he speculates, he writes this, and I quote, they wrote as if history had little to do with them, writing almost as a hermetic literary culture. And I was just wondering what your feelings are about that. Do you agree or disagree, and why?
Well, that's a question that really should go to Charles Simic, I think. But he's talking about American poets, is he?
At the end of the century.
Yeah, again, I think it should go to him. But, what can one say? There seem to be very many very interesting American poets who I think are absolutely equal to the moment. Forgive me for putting my hand up, I can't quite see. But for example, well, just off the top of my head, C.K. Williams, Yusuf Kamenyaka, a couple of my colleagues, just talking about people who are on the corridor, as it were, in Princeton, I think are writing poems that are attempting to make sense of this moment. I don't think American poets have been guilty of some sort of dereliction. Judy? I don't think they've gone completely in the direction of beauty, for example. But a bit of both. But one thing I would say is this. When did Charlie write that? When did he write that?
2001.
2001? Before September 11th, maybe?
No, I think it was actually a few weeks after.
Right. Alas, I think, I don't want to get involved in truisms and trite expressions, but there may have been a danger at one point that there was a sense that things happened elsewhere, that history happened elsewhere. I don't think that's certainly not the case anymore. It never was the case, but I can certainly understand how it might have been perceived as such by some people. Is this answering your question?
Yes.
Okay. Any other takers? Complaints? Dear Abbeys?
What's a gulder?
A gulder is the noise made by a hound. A gulder, I guess, a guttural. It's onomatopoeic, I guess. A gulder. I'm sorry for that. That was a very, very poor impression of a hound. But something along those lines. A gull, a gulder. A gulder. A gull, there's an expression in Ireland. If one were to say that so-and-so had not the slightest hope, was nowhere in the ballpark of achieving something, one would say of him or her, he wouldn't have come within a bagel's gall of achieving whatever it was. A bagel's gall being something that carries for quite a long distance, as you know. So, it's a measurement in Ireland. Like the cubit, which we were discussing earlier. Any other thoughts there at all? You don't have to. Observations? Well, should I read another couple of poems, maybe? And then we'll call. Is that all right?
Yes.
Is there enough there?
Yes.
Well, what do we say? You know what? I think I'll read a couple of new poems, and that'll see us nicely. There, I hope. Let me see what I would do. Forgive me, I don't really know my way on this. I'm going to read two poems. This first one's called Medley for Moran Her. Medley for Moran Her. Number one. The sound box is made of a horse's head. The resonator is horse skin. The strings and bow are horse hair. 2. The Moran Khur is the thoroughbred of Mongolian violins. Its call is the call of the stallion to the mare. 3. A call which may no more be gainsaid than that of gin to gin through jasmine-weighted air. 4. A call that may no more be gainsaid than that of blood kin to kin through a body-strewn central square. 5. A square in which they'll heap the horses' hens by the heaps of horse skin and the heaps of horse hair. I'll end with a few sections from a series of poems, sequence of poems I've been writing for a while, really since the war, this present war started off. Poems about a series of battles involving horses from through the ages. Excuse me. So I'll just read a few of those, and that will bring us out. I just want to say what a great delight it has been to be here for this past couple of days. Great pleasure to have spent so much time in the company of so many wonderful people, and thank you very much indeed for having me. Horse latitudes. Horse latitudes, as you know, was the area in the North Atlantic there where they tended to become becalmed. Ships were becalmed, the doldrums, and where apparently they're named the horse latitudes because, why am I laughing at this? They would throw the horses overboard just to get, with the possibility of, it's not funny, that they might move on a bit more speedily. Anyway, horse latitudes. Beijing. I could still hear the musicians cajoling those thousands of clay horses and horsemen through the squeeze when I woke beside Carlotta. Life size also terracotta. The sky was still a terracotta frieze over which her grandfather still held sway, with the set square, fret saw, stencil, plumb line, and carpenter's pencil his grandfather brought from Roma. Proud-fleshed Carlotta, hypersarcoma. For now, our highest ambition was simply to bear the light of the day we had once been planning to seize. Bannockburn. Though he was mounted on a cob rather than a warhorse, the Bruce still managed to sidestep a spear from Henry de Bohun and tax de Bohun's pole with his broad-based poleaxe and leave de Bohun's charger somewhat leer. Her grandfather had yet to find a use for the two-timing partisan his grandfather brought man to man against all those Ferdinandis, until he saw it might come in handy for whacking the thingamybobs of pine and fir and spruce, and all such trees as volunteer. Blay. Her wetsuit like a coat of mail worn by a French knight from the time a knight could still cause a ruction by direct charging his rouncy, when an Englishman's home was his bouncy castle, when abduction and seduction went hand in glove. Now Carlotta would climb from the hotel pool in Nashville, take off her mask, and set a spill to a gauloise, as one might set a spill to the fuse of a falconet, and the walls of her chest assail. The French, meanwhile, were still struggling to prime their weapons of mass destruction. Let me see, I'll just keep in mind. Blackwater Fort, I'm skipping a few. Something like those. As I had held Carlotta close that night, we watched some Xenophon embedded with the 5th Marines in the old Sunni triangle make a half-assed attempt to untangle the ghastly from the price of gasoline. There was a distant fanfaron in the Nashville sky where the wind had now drawn itself up and pinned on her breast a Texaco star. Why, Carlotta, the house of tar? Might it have to do with the gross imports of crude oil Bush will come clean on only when the Tigris comes clean? Small birds, this is Blenheim, small birds were sounding the alert as I followed her unladen steed through a dell so dark and dank she might have sported the waders her grandfather had worn at the nadir of his career, scouring the outer banks from Mummichog and Menhaden. Those weeks and months in the doldrums, coming back as he ran his thumb along an old Venetian blind, in the hope that something might come to mind, that he might yet animadvert the maiden name of that iron maiden on which he was drawing a blank. Brandywine. I crouched in my own little ease by the pool at the Vanderbilt, where Carlotta crouched, sputter-sput, just as she had in the scanner, when the nurse, keen-sighted as a lanner, picked out a tumour like a rabbit scot on dark ground. It was as if a fine silt, white sand or silicate, had clogged her snorkel. Her goggles had fogged, and Carlotta surfaced like flot to be skimmed off some great cast iron pot, as garble is skimmed off, or lees painstakingly drained by turnings and tilts from a man-sized barrel or butt. This is badly casseret. Pork barrels, pork butts, the widescreen surround sound of a massed attack upon the thin red cellulose by those dust or fussed or must cells that cause the tears to well and well and well. At which I see him turning up his nose as if he'd bitten on a powder pack, like yet another sad sepoy who won't fall for the British ploy of greasing with ham the hammer, or smoothing over Carlotta's grammar. On which Bush will come clean. Her grandfather, a man who sees no lack of manhood in the lachrymose. Let me see. Getting there. So, Byzantine. As I was bringing up her rear, a young dragoon would cock a snook at the gunners raking the knob of high wood. Tongue like a scaldy in a nest. A scaldy's a little bird. A fledgling, a scaldy. Tongue like a scaldy in a nest. Hadn't a Garibaldi what might lie behind that low-level throb like a niggle in her appointment book? Dust, bust, must. The dragoon nonplussed by his charger taking the rust, and despite her recalcitrance, Carlotta making a modest advance, when the thought of a falchineer falling to with his two-faced reaping hook now brought back her grandfather's job. Burma. Her grandfather's job was to cut the vocal cords of each pack mule with a single swift excision, a helper standing by to wrench the mule's head fiercely to one side and drench it with hooch he'd kept since Prohibition. Why, Carlotta wondered, that fearsome tool? Was it for fear the mules might bray and give their position away? At which I see him thumb the shade as if he were once more testing a blade, and hear the twofold snapping shut of his fourfold brass-edged carpenter's rule, and give away their position. Thank you.